President Biden racked up a big political win this week when the Senate passed his $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill with some Republican support. But that was Tuesday. Now the work really begins to get Democrats' support. Yeah, Democrats. And Mr. Biden needs almost all of them, from Senator Joe Manchin to the squad in the House, to fully pass his infrastructure agenda. That agenda also includes a $3.5 trillion budget measure. So to talk more about this, I want to bring in Steven Portnoy. Thank you, Steven. Steve, are you in Washington? I'm not sure where you are, but I'm going to assume you're in Washington.
Yeah.
So listen, Steven.
In my home studio here in D.C.
Love it. So what do we know about how the White House is working with congressional Democrats to get the infrastructure bill on his desk and signed? Because he has sort of two warring parties in a way. He has, kind of fiscal. He has Democrats with fiscal concerns, but then he also has Democrats who say, "Listen, if you want to make big change, you got to go big or go home."
Well, that's exactly right, Anne-Marie. I mean, look, you have two factions in the Democratic Party. You have moderates like Joe Manchin, who expressed the other day that $3.5 trillion in the human infrastructure proposal gives him pause. And then you have progressive Democrats who essentially say it's not enough. And their concern is that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the $1.2 trillion measure that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, doesn't do enough to advance the president's goals. The president is trying to thread that needle and trying to say to the moderates in his party and the progressives in his party that if they work together and get behind his Build Back Better agenda, that the country will be better off. Where the rubber meets the road is in the actual legislating and the actual deal making. And where this stands, that the Senate acted this week to adopt the $3.5 trillion budget resolution. It's a non-binding step that sets the stage for the reconciliation process to come. What has to happen next? Well, the House has to take up that same $3.5 trillion budget resolution. The margins for the Democrats in the House are thin. They can only afford to lose a very small handful of votes. And so Speaker Pelosi is going to have to work with her colleagues, if they want to get this done, to keep everybody in line. Once the House acts to adopt the budget resolution, then it comes time to actually fill in or reconcile the appropriations and see to it that they are lined up with the president's priorities. And that's where Joe Manchin has the concerns about the actual spending and possible tax implications of it all. So the House will come back the week after next to get into these details and to take up the work that the Senate left town having accomplished this week.
Listen, I want to pivot over to Afghanistan. As we know, the drawdown schedule was sped up to the end of this month, and it seems as soon as that happened, the Taliban also sped up its own agenda, taking city after city throughout Afghanistan. And now we're hearing that the capital could fall in as little as 90 days. What are we hearing from the White House about this deteriorating security situation?
Well, Press Secretary Jen Psaki told me yesterday that the White House is watching closely the deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan. And I asked her about the U.S. intelligence estimate that indicates that as little as 30 to 60 days, Kabul could come under pressure. And as little as 90 days from now, if Kabul does come under pressure, the Afghan government could fall. The press secretary said yesterday that nothing is inevitable in the president's view, that the president's mind on this has not changed, that he is going to end America's forever war ahead of its 20th anniversary. But the fact is the Taliban is on the march, that they continue to take province after province. 9 provinces have fallen to the Taliban in the past week. And the press secretary said that the hope is that the Taliban will meet at the table with the existing Afghan government to work out some kind of negotiated solution here. But the Taliban is on the march. What gives the White House any indication that the Taliban is interested in a negotiated solution? Press Secretary Jen Psaki said yesterday that the Taliban needs to consider how it's being viewed on the international stage, how it sees its role going forward. And some critics of the administration raise their eyebrows at that notion, that in any way the Taliban cares what the international community thinks of it. I mean, the international community saw what the Taliban did in the late 1990s in the lead up to 9/11, presiding over what was essentially a terrorist state. So where things stand right now, the U.S. has sent senior envoy Zalmay Khalilzad to Doha for talks there, and the effort is to try to get the Taliban on board with these conversations and to get them essentially to help negotiate this settlement that the administration is hoping for. The press secretary also said yesterday that the fate of Afghanistan rests on the shoulders of the Afghan security forces that have been trained and paid by Americans. I asked the press secretary about the risk of American materiel falling into the hands of the Taliban. And she also said that this was something that the White House and the U.S. were focused on, concerned about. And she even used the phrase retrograde to describe how American forces have been dealing with some of the equipment they've been leaving behind.
So, we know that Afghan forces were trained by American forces, and they are well trained and well equipped. But what the U.S. was offering was air support, and that seemed to be making all the difference. When we look at the forecasts, which are pretty dismal, if Afghanistan becomes essentially a Taliban state and goes back to where it was 20 years ago, what sort of mark could that leave on, the Biden administration, the Biden presidency? Is that something that the White House is considering?
Well, I think it's in the back of everyone's minds, and certainly at the White House, it's something they're thinking about. But the president has been consistent. He was asked this question this week, whether he regrets his decision to announce that all U.S. forces will be leaving Afghanistan by the end of this month. And there are two immediate concerns right now. The first is making sure that Afghan translators, people who worked with the United States military and their families, can be safely evacuated from the country in advance of a possible Taliban takeover of the entire country or even the provinces where they might live. That's the first concern. Another concern happens to be the thousands of Americans who are stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. And that is increasingly a concern as the Taliban continues to make advances. When it comes to the broader strategic and political considerations for the president, these are things that he may be thinking about but hasn't indicated publicly that he's worried about, inasmuch as he's concerned that perhaps the country will look to him and say, it doesn't like what is going on in Afghanistan, and there's no indication that the president's worried that voters will blame him for it at this point.
Steven Portnoy, really interesting. Thank you, Steven.